The woman who rode into Rock Springs, Wyoming on that scorching August afternoon in 1876 looked like she had been to hell and back, and Ethan Quinn watched her from the porch of the saloon, where he had been nursing a whiskey and contemplating his next cattle drive. Her dress was torn at the hem, dust caked every inch of visible skin, and her chestnut hair hung in tangled waves down her back, but it was her eyes that caught his attention, green as spring grass and filled with a determination that seemed to burn brighter than the relentless sun overhead. She dismounted from a bay mare that looked as exhausted as its rider, tied the reins to the hitching post with trembling fingers, and glanced up and down the main street as though searching for something specific. Ethan set his glass down and leaned forward, curiosity getting the better of him. Strangers were common enough in Rock Springs, a town that had grown around the coal mines and the railroad, but women traveling alone were rare, and this one had an air about her that suggested she was running from something or towards something equally pressing. She pushed through the doors of the general store, and Ethan found himself standing without quite knowing why. He had been a cowboy for 12 years, since he turned 18 and left his family's struggling farm in Missouri, and in that time he had learned to trust his instincts. Something about this woman spoke to those instincts, whispering that her arrival would change things in ways he could not yet foresee. He crossed the dusty street, his boots making soft thuds against the packed earth, and entered the store just as she was asking the proprietor about supplies for a journey into the mountains. The shopkeeper, old Samuel Bradshaw, was shaking his head with the slow deliberation of a man who had seen too many foolish ventures end in tragedy. "Madam, I cannot in good conscience sell you supplies for that kind of trip without asking if you know what you are getting into," Samuel said, his weathered hands resting on the counter. "Those mountains are unforgiving, especially for someone traveling alone." "I am not asking for your conscience, sir, only your goods," she replied, and her voice was like honey mixed with steel, sweet but unyielding. "I have money, and I know what I need." Ethan stepped closer, and both of them turned to look at him. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 23 or 24, with a face that would have been beautiful if not for the exhaustion etched into every feature. There was a small cut above her left eyebrow, already scabbing over, and a bruise on her cheekbone that was turning from purple to yellow. "Pardon the intrusion," Ethan said, removing his hat in a gesture his mother had drilled into him years ago. "But Samuel here is right. Those mountains are no place for someone unprepared, and if you do not mind my saying so, you look like you have already had more than your share of trouble." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she would tell him to mind his own business. Instead, she seemed to deflate slightly, her shoulders dropping as though the weight she carried had suddenly become too much to bear upright. "I appreciate your concern," she said carefully, "but I have come too far to turn back now. I have a map and I intend to follow it." "A map to what?" Ethan asked, and he saw Samuel's eyebrows rise with interest. She hesitated, her fingers moving to the leather satchel that hung at her side in a protective gesture. "That is my business." "Fair enough," Ethan said, though he made no move to leave. "But if you are heading into those mountains, you will need more than supplies. You will need someone who knows the terrain, who can navigate the passes and deal with whatever you might encounter. Bears, mountain lions, bandits, storms that come out of nowhere. Take your pick of dangers." "I cannot afford a guide," she said bluntly, and he saw a flash of something like shame cross her face before she mastered it. "I was not asking for payment," Ethan replied, surprising himself with the offer even as the words left his mouth. "I was suggesting a partnership. You have a destination, and I have the skills to get you there. Seems like we could help each other." She studied him with those sharp green eyes, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being weighed and measured against some internal standard he could not see. Finally, she seemed to come to a decision. "Why would you help me? You do not know me, and I could be leading you into any manner of trouble." "Maybe," Ethan conceded with a small smile, "but I have been working cattle for the better part of 12 years, and I am due for a change of scenery. Besides, my gut tells me you are worth the risk." She blinked, clearly not having expected such straightforward honesty, and for the first time since she entered the store, something like hope flickered across her features. "My name is Grace Opal," she said finally, extending her hand. "And yes, I am heading into trouble, though not the kind you might think." He took her hand, noting the calluses on her palm and the strength in her grip. "Ethan Quinn, and I have found that the best kind of trouble is the kind you walk into with your eyes open." Samuel cleared his throat, reminding them both of his presence. "So shall I prepare supplies for 2 then?" Grace looked at Ethan, and he could see the calculation behind her eyes, the weighing of pride against necessity. "Yes," she said at last, "for 2. They spent the next hour gathering what they would need. Dried beef, hardtack, coffee, beans, ammunition, rope, blankets, and a canvas tarp for shelter. Ethan added a few items Grace had not thought of, things that spoke to his experience in the wilderness, like extra matches wrapped in oilcloth and a small pot for boiling water. Grace paid for everything with coins she counted out carefully, and Ethan noticed that when she closed her purse, there was very little left inside. As they loaded the supplies onto their horses, Ethan's buckskin gelding nickering softly at Grace's mare, he decided to test the waters. "So this map of yours," he said casually, checking the straps on his saddlebags. "Does it lead to something worth dying for?" Grace was silent for so long he thought she would not answer. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and brittle at the edges. She opened it carefully, and Ethan saw a hand-drawn map covered in faded ink, showing mountain ranges, river systems, and a large X marked in what appeared to be a valley deep in the wilderness. "Gold," she said simply. "My father spent 20 years searching for it. He was part of the rush in California in '49, but he never found his fortune there. Later, he heard stories from trappers and prospectors about a vein of gold in these mountains, untouched and waiting. He made this map from their descriptions and his own explorations, but he died before he could reach it." "I am sorry for your loss," Ethan said, and meant it. "When did he pass?" "6 months ago," Grace replied, her voice tight. "Pneumonia took him in the winter. Before he died, he gave me this map and made me promise I would find the gold. He said it was our family's future, the only thing that could save us from poverty." Ethan looked at the map more carefully, tracing the route with his eyes. It would take them deep into the Wind River Range, through territory that was challenging even for experienced mountaineers. "This will not be an easy journey." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Grace said, folding the map and returning it to her satchel with the same careful reverence she might show a religious text. "My mother is living with my sister in St. Louis, and they are barely surviving. My brother-in-law lost his job at the factory, and they have 3 children to feed. If I can find this gold, I can change all their lives. I can give my mother the security she deserves after years of struggle." The weight of responsibility in her voice was something Ethan understood intimately. He had sent money home to his own family for years, until his younger siblings were grown and his parents' farm was finally on solid footing. He knew what it meant to carry other people's hopes on your shoulders. "Then we had better make sure you reach it," he said firmly. "When do you want to leave?" "Tomorrow morning, first light," Grace said, and there was gratitude in her eyes that she did not put into words. They agreed to meet at the livery stable at dawn, and Ethan watched as Grace led her horse away, heading toward the boarding house at the edge of town. He spent the rest of the evening checking his gear and trying to ignore the voice in his head that said he was being a fool, that he was risking his life for a woman he had just met, and a treasure that might not even exist. But something about Grace Opal had gotten under his skin in the space of a single conversation. It was not just her beauty, though he would be lying if he said he had not noticed the curve of her jaw or the way her eyes flashed when she was determined. It was her courage, the way she refused to let fear or exhaustion stop her from pursuing what she believed was right. It was the same quality he had always admired in the best cowboys he had worked with, the ones who would ride through storms and face down stampedes without flinching. He slept poorly that night, his dreams filled with mountain passes and glittering gold, and woke well before dawn with a sense of anticipation he had not felt in years. Grace was already at the livery when he arrived, her horse saddled and her supplies secured. She had changed into clothing more suitable for travel, sturdy trousers, a man's shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face. She looked more like a pioneer woman ready to homestead than the dusty, desperate figure who had ridden into town the day before. "I was worried you might have changed your mind," she said as he approached. "I said I would be here," Ethan replied, swinging into his saddle with the easy grace of someone who had spent more than half his life on horseback. "And I keep my word." They rode out of Rock Springs as the sun was just beginning to paint the eastern horizon in shades of rose and gold, leaving behind the coal smoke and noise of civilization for the vast silence of the Wyoming wilderness. The land here was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, with sagebrush plains giving way to rolling hills that climbed steadily toward the mountains. The Wind River Range rose in the distance like a wall of stone and snow, and Ethan felt the familiar thrill of heading into unknown territory. For the first few hours, they rode in companionable silence, both of them conserving their energy for the journey ahead. Ethan used the time to observe Grace, noting the way she sat her horse with confidence and how her eyes constantly scanned the landscape, alert for any sign of danger. She was no pampered city woman, that much was clear. She had grown up knowing hardship, and it had made her strong. When they stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat a cold meal of jerky and biscuits, Ethan decided it was time to learn more about his traveling companion. "Tell me about your father," he said, settling onto a flat rock and taking a long drink from his canteen. "What kind of man chases gold for 20 years? Grace sat near him, close enough for conversation but maintaining a careful distance that spoke to her awareness of propriety, even out here in the wilderness. "He was a dreamer," she said after a moment. "The kind of man who always believed that the next venture would be the one to pay off. My mother used to say he was born with wanderlust in his blood and gold dust in his eyes. That must have been hard on your family." "It was," Grace admitted, her gaze distant. "We moved constantly when I was a child, always following some new lead or opportunity. My father would work odd jobs to keep us fed, but every spare penny went toward his searches. My mother was a seamstress, and she took in work wherever we settled, sometimes sewing late into the night just to make sure we had enough." "But you loved him anyway," Ethan observed, hearing the affection beneath the frustration in her voice. "I did," Grace said softly. "He could be infuriating, reckless, selfish even, but he never stopped trying to give us a better life, and he never lost hope, no matter how many times he failed. When he gave me this map, he was so certain it would lead to something real. His last words were, 'Grace, my girl, it is all there waiting for you. Do not let my years of searching be for nothing.'" Ethan heard the burden in those words, the weight of a dying man's dreams passed to his daughter. "And what if the gold is not there?" he asked gently. "What if the map is wrong, or someone else found it first, or it never existed at all?" Grace's jaw tightened, but she met his eyes steadily. "Then at least I will know I tried. I will know I did everything I could to honor his memory and help my family. I cannot live with myself if I do not at least try." There was steel in her voice, and Ethan found himself admiring her even more. She was not naive about the odds, but she was willing to face them anyway. "That took a special kind of courage." "Then we will find out together," he said, and he saw something shift in her expression, a slight softening around her eyes. "Why are you really doing this, Ethan?" she asked suddenly. "You said you were due for a change of scenery, but that cannot be the whole truth. Nobody risks their life for a stranger on a whim." He considered deflecting, giving her some easy answer that would satisfy her curiosity without revealing too much. But there was something about the way she looked at him, direct and unflinching, that demanded honesty. "I spent the last 12 years working other people's cattle, following other people's orders, living by other people's schedules," he said slowly, working out his thoughts even as he spoke them. "I am good at what I do, and I have made decent money, but somewhere along the way I realized I was just going through the motions. I was not building anything of my own or working toward any real goal. I was just existing." He paused, surprised by how much he was revealing. "When I saw you yesterday, so determined and fierce despite everything you had been through, it reminded me that there are still things worth taking risks for. Maybe I am helping you, or maybe you are helping me. Either way, I would rather be out here chasing gold that might not exist than sitting in that saloon wondering if there is more to life than what I have been living." Grace was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. "Thank you for your honesty," she said finally, "and for your help. I do not know many men who would be so forthright. Out here, there is no point in being anything else," Ethan said with a slight smile. "The wilderness has a way of stripping away pretense." They continued their journey as the afternoon heat intensified, following a trail that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. Ethan navigated by a combination of Grace's map, his own knowledge of the region, and the position of the sun. They crossed streams swollen with snowmelt from the mountains, forded shallow rivers that soaked their boots, and climbed steadily upward as the plains gave way to foothills covered in pine and aspen. As evening approached, Ethan began looking for a suitable place to make camp. He found a spot near a small creek, sheltered by a stand of cottonwood trees that would provide some protection from the wind and concealment from any unwanted eyes. They worked together to set up camp, falling into an easy rhythm as they unsaddled the horses, gathered firewood, and prepared their simple meal. Grace proved to be competent at camp tasks, handling the horses with confidence and starting the fire with efficiency that spoke of experience. They cooked beans and bacon in a skillet, supplemented by the last of the fresh bread Grace had purchased in Rock Springs, and ate as the stars began to appear overhead in a spectacular display unmarred by any city lights. "I had forgotten how beautiful the night sky could be," Grace said, leaning back against her saddle and gazing upward. "In St. Louis, you can barely see the stars through all the smoke and lamplight. This is one of the things I would miss most if I ever had to leave," Ethan agreed, following her gaze to the glittering sweep of the Milky Way. "On cattle drives, I would sometimes take the night watch just so I could sit under stars like these and think." "Think about what?" Grace asked, her voice soft in the darkness. "Everything and nothing," Ethan said with a quiet laugh. "The future, mostly. What I wanted out of life, whether I was on the right path. I never came to any great conclusions, but there was something peaceful about sitting with those questions under all that vastness. My father used to say that the stars were like gold dust scattered across black velvet, Grace said. He would point out constellations and tell me stories about the heroes and monsters they represented. Those are some of my best memories of him, the times when he was not chasing his next dream but was just present with us, content in the moment. They fell silent, and Ethan felt a strange intimacy in sharing this quiet space with her. This woman he had known for barely a day, but who already felt like someone important in his life. He pushed the thought aside, telling himself he was being foolish, that the isolation and the adventure were making him read more into their connection than was really there. "You should get some sleep," he said, rising to add more wood to the fire. "I will take the first watch." "You do not have to do that," Grace protested. "I can keep watch as well." "I know you can," Ethan said, "but let me do this tonight. You have been pushing yourself hard for who knows how long, and you need rest. Tomorrow we will set up a proper schedule." Grace looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. "Thank you," she said quietly, and rolled herself in her blanket near the fire. Ethan sat with his rifle across his knees, listening to the sounds of the night. Crickets sang in the grass, an owl called from somewhere in the trees, and the creek burbled softly over its rocky bed. He watched Grace sleep, seeing how even in rest her body remained tense, ready to wake at any moment. She was a woman who had learned not to let down her guard completely, and he wondered what other hardships she had faced beyond the ones she had shared. The night passed without incident, and when Ethan woke Grace for her turn at watch a few hours before dawn, she was alert immediately, sitting up and reaching for the rifle he had set beside her without any of the grogginess most people showed when roused from sleep. "Anything?" she asked quietly. "Nothing but nature," Ethan assured her. "Wake me at first light and we will get an early start." He lay down in the spot she had vacated, still warm from her body heat, and fell into the light sleep of someone accustomed to sleeping in the open. When Grace shook his shoulder as the sky was just beginning to lighten, he woke feeling more refreshed than he had in months. They broke camp efficiently, ate a quick breakfast of coffee and hardtack, and were back on the trail as the sun rose over the mountains ahead. The terrain grew steeper and more challenging as the day progressed, with the trail narrowing to little more than a game path in places. Ethan led the way, picking their route carefully and occasionally dismounting to lead his horse over particularly treacherous sections. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed high enough that patches of old snow still clung to the shadowed areas, and the air had taken on a crisp quality that made breathing feel like swallowing ice. The horses were laboring now, their breath coming in heavy snorts, and Ethan called for more frequent rest stops to keep the animals from being overtaxed. During one such stop, as they stood on an outcropping that offered a spectacular view of the valley below, Grace pulled out her map again and studied it intently. "According to this, we should be looking for a distinctive rock formation," she said, tracing the route with her finger. "My father described it as 2 pillars of stone standing like sentinels at the entrance to a canyon. Once we find that, we follow the canyon for about 5 miles until we reach a waterfall, and the gold should be somewhere near there." Ethan scanned the landscape, looking for anything that matched that description. The mountains were full of unusual rock formations, but he knew they would have to get closer before they could identify the specific one Grace's father had marked. "How did your father come by this information?" Ethan asked. "You mentioned trappers and prospectors. Did he meet them himself?" "Some of them," Grace said, folding the map carefully. "He spent winters in various mining camps and trading posts, and he would trade labor for stories. One winter, somewhere around 1868 or 69, He met an old trapper named Bill Morrison, who claimed to have seen a vein of gold while hunting mountain goats. Bill said he marked the location in his mind but never went back because he was content with his life and did not want the trouble gold would bring. If this Bill Morrison knew where the gold was, why did he tell your father? Ethan asked, his skepticism evident. In my experience, men who find gold do not generally share that information. Bill was dying, Grace said quietly. My father helped care for him through his final illness, and Bill wanted someone to benefit from his knowledge. He drew a rough map for my father, describing the landmarks. My father spent the next several years trying to verify the location and add details to the map. And your father never made it here himself. He did, twice, Grace said. The first time was in '72. He got close but was turned back by an early snowstorm that nearly killed him. The second time was in '74, and he actually found the canyon, but he had come alone and unprepared for the technical climbing required to reach the waterfall. He realized he needed help, proper equipment, and more supplies than he had brought. He planned to return the following year with a partner, but he never found anyone he trusted enough, and then his health started to fail. The story had the ring of truth to it, and Ethan found himself believing that somewhere in these mountains, there really might be gold waiting to be found. Whether they could actually reach it was another question entirely. They continued climbing as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, and just as Ethan was thinking they would need to find another place to camp, he saw them. Two massive pillars of stone, weathered and ancient, rising from the mountainside like the fingers of some buried giant. They were unmistakable, and exactly as Grace's father had described them. There, he said, pointing, and heard Grace's sharp intake of breath. That is it, she said, and her voice was filled with wonder and relief. We found it. They approached the pillars as the light was fading, and Ethan could see that they did indeed mark the entrance to a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountainside. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, and the floor was littered with rocks and fallen debris that would make passage challenging. It is too late to enter tonight, Ethan said, though he could see the impatience in Grace's eyes. We do not know what the footing is like in there, and I would rather not risk the horses or ourselves in the dark. We will camp here and go in at first light. Grace nodded reluctantly, clearly wanting to push on but recognizing the wisdom in his words. They made camp in the shelter of the pillars, which provided excellent protection from the wind and a natural defense point should they need it. As they ate their evening meal, Grace was visibly excited, her exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the face of being so close to her goal. She talked about what she would do with the gold, how she would divide it among her family members, and the plans her mother had spoken of before Grace left St. Louis. My mother wants to buy a small house somewhere quiet, Grace said, her eyes bright in the firelight. She has spent her whole life living in rented rooms and temporary lodgings, always one missed payment away from being on the street. Can you imagine what it would mean to her to own her own home, to have that security? It would mean everything, Ethan said, thinking of his own mother and how she had cried with joy when the bank finally acknowledged that their farm was paid off in full. Security is something you cannot put a price on. My sister wants to send her children to proper schools, Grace continued. She is terrified they will end up in the factories like their father, breathing in cotton dust and working 16-hour days for pennies. And my brother, he is only 19, but he has such potential. He wants to study engineering, but there has never been money for university. Ethan listened to her dreams, seeing how the gold represented not greed but hope, not luxury but the basic stability that most people took for granted. It made him even more determined to help her succeed. What about you? he asked. "What do you want for yourself?" Grace paused, clearly not having expected the question. "I want to know my family is cared for," she said slowly. "Beyond that, I have not thought much about it. I suppose I always imagined I would get married eventually, have a family of my own, but it has never seemed like the right time. There has always been some crisis to manage, some emergency that required my attention." "You have spent your whole life taking care of other people," Ethan observed. "Maybe it is time someone took care of you." Grace met his eyes across the fire, and something passed between them, a current of understanding and attraction that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge aloud. "Maybe," she said softly, "but first, we have gold to find." They settled into their sleeping arrangements, and this time Grace did not protest when Ethan offered to take the first watch again. He sat in the darkness, thinking about the woman sleeping a few feet away and the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he had been contemplating another cattle drive, another season of the same routine he had followed for years. Now he was sitting in the mountains, hunting for gold with a woman who was beginning to matter to him more than was probably wise. He tried to tell himself it was just the circumstances, the adventure and isolation creating a false sense of connection. But he knew, deep down, that it was more than that. Grace Opal was unlike anyone he had ever met, and the more time he spent with her, the more he wanted to keep spending time with her. The night remained quiet, and when dawn came, they were both awake and eager to continue. They left most of their gear at the camp, taking only what they would need for a day's exploration: water, rope, a pick and shovel, and their weapons. The canyon proved even more challenging than it had looked from outside, with the floor rising and falling in steep grades and large boulders forcing them to lead the horses carefully around obstacles. The walls rose high on either side, blocking out much of the morning light and giving the canyon a close, almost claustrophobic feeling. Water trickled down the rocks in places, evidence of underground springs, and hardy plants clung to crevices wherever they could find purchase. They had been walking for perhaps 3 hours, the horses picking their way carefully over the rocky terrain, when Ethan heard it. The sound of falling water, distant but unmistakable. He stopped and held up his hand, and Grace halted beside him, her head tilted as she listened. "The waterfall," she breathed, and the hope in her voice was almost painful to hear. They continued forward with renewed energy, and as they rounded a bend in the canyon, they saw it. A waterfall cascaded down the cliff face from a height of at least 50 feet, the water catching the sunlight and creating shifting rainbows in the spray. It was beautiful and wild, and at the base of the falls, there was a pool of clear water surrounded by massive boulders. Grace pulled out her map with shaking hands, comparing what she saw to what her father had drawn. "This is it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is the exact place." "Where did your father say the gold would be?" Ethan asked, scanning the area. "In the rock face near the waterfall," Grace said, moving closer. "He said there should be a vein visible in the stone, running through the granite." They secured the horses and began examining the cliff face, moving systematically along the rock and looking for any sign of gold. The spray from the waterfall soaked them both within minutes, and the rocks were slippery, making the search dangerous as well as difficult. Ethan was beginning to wonder if they had the wrong waterfall, or if the map was less accurate than Grace believed, when he saw it. A glint of something different in the rock, a streak of color that was not quite the same as the surrounding stone. He called Grace over, and together they examined the spot more closely. It was gold, without question. A vein of it running through the rock, thin in some places and thicker in others, but definitely there. Grace let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, her hand reaching out to touch the precious metal as though to verify it was real. "He was right," she said, tears streaming down her face to mix with the waterfall spray. "My father was right. It is real." Ethan felt his own throat tighten at her joy. After everything she had been through, all the hardship and doubt, she had found what she was looking for. "We need to extract it," he said practically, though he hated to interrupt her moment. "And we need to figure out how much is here." They spent the rest of the day working at the rock face with the pick and shovel, carefully extracting chunks of gold-bearing quartz. The work was back-breaking and dangerous, with the constant spray making everything slippery, and the height requiring them to work on a narrow ledge above the pool. But they persisted, and by the time the sun was beginning to set, they had accumulated a pile of rock that Ethan estimated contained several $1,000s worth of gold. "We cannot carry all of this out in one trip," he said, examining their haul. "We will need to make multiple trips, or find a way to process the ore here and take only the pure gold." "Multiple trips," Grace said firmly. "I do not want to risk losing any of it to a mistake in processing. We will take what we can carry now and return for the rest." They loaded their saddlebags with as much gold-bearing rock as the horses could safely carry and began the trek back through the canyon. The journey out was even more treacherous than the journey in, with the added weight making the horses move more carefully and the fading light making it harder to see obstacles. By the time they reached their original camp by the pillars, it was full dark, and both of them were exhausted. They collapsed near the fire that Ethan built, too tired to do more than eat a cold meal and drink water before sleep claimed them. Over the next 4 days, they made 3 more trips into the canyon, each time extracting more gold and carefully transporting it back to their base camp. The work was grueling, and by the end of the 4th day, both of them were covered in bruises and scrapes, their hands blistered and their muscles screaming in protest. But they had done it. They had extracted what Ethan estimated was at least $15,000 worth of gold, possibly more depending on the purity and the market price. It was a fortune, enough to transform Grace's family's life and secure their future for years to come. As they sat by the fire on their final night at the canyon, Grace seemed overwhelmed by what they had accomplished. She kept touching the bags of ore as though to reassure herself they were real, and Ethan saw a mixture of joy and disbelief in her expression. "I cannot believe we actually did it," she said softly. "After everything, after all my father's years of searching, we found it and extracted it. It is more than I ever dared to hope for." "You did it," Ethan corrected gently. "You had the courage to come out here, to follow the map, despite everyone who would have told you it was foolish. You honored your father's memory and secured your family's future. That takes remarkable strength." Grace looked at him, and in the firelight her eyes were luminous. "I could not have done any of this without you," she said. "If you had not offered to help me, if you had not guided me here and worked alongside me, I would never have reached the gold. You gave me the partnership I needed." Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that what he felt for Grace had grown far beyond simple attraction or camaraderie. Somewhere in the past week, as they had worked together and faced challenges side by side, he had fallen in love with her. Not the wild, impulsive love of youth, but the deeper, steadier love of 2 people who had seen each other at their best and worst and still chose to stand together. "Grace," he said slowly, trying to find the right words, "these past days with you have been some of the best of my life. Not because of the gold, but because of you. Your courage, your determination, your kindness even when you were exhausted and hurting. You have reminded me that there is more to life than just existing, that there are things worth taking risks for, and people worth standing beside." Grace's breath caught and she set down the cup she had been holding. "Ethan, let me finish," he said, his heart pounding. "I know we have only known each other a short time, and I know you have responsibilities to your family and plans that do not include a cowboy who has spent most of his life drifting from job to job. But I need you to know that somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. And if there is any chance that you might feel the same way, I would like to explore what that might mean." The silence that followed felt like an eternity, and Ethan braced himself for rejection, for the gentle explanation that she cared for him as a friend but nothing more. Instead, Grace stood up and crossed the distance between them, sitting down beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. "I do feel the same way," she said quietly. "I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was just the circumstances or the adventure, but I cannot deny it anymore. When I look at you, I see everything I have ever wanted in a partner, someone strong and capable, but also kind. Someone who listens and respects my abilities while still offering help when I need it. Someone who makes me feel like I could do anything as long as we are facing it together." Ethan turned to face her fully, and the emotion in her eyes took his breath away. "Then keep the gold," he said, echoing the thought that had been forming in his mind for days. "Use it to take care of your family, to give them the security they need. But let me be your partner in everything else. Let me stand beside you and build a life together." "Keep the gold, I want the partner," Grace repeated softly. And then she was laughing and crying at the same time, and Ethan found himself doing the same. He pulled her close, feeling her arms wrap around him, and for a long moment they simply held each other. Two people who had found something far more valuable than gold in these wild mountains. When they finally pulled apart, Grace looked up at him with shining eyes. "What does this mean, practically speaking?" she asked. "Where do we go from here? First, we get this gold back to Rock Springs and arrange to have it processed and sold," Ethan said, his mind already working through the logistics. "Then you send money to your family in St. Louis, enough to secure their immediate needs and set them up for the future. After that, we figure out our own future together." "I like the sound of that," Grace said. "Together, it has a nice ring to it." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about possibilities and dreams with the freedom of people who had suddenly found their path forward. Ethan spoke of his desire to buy land, to build something permanent instead of always working for someone else. Grace talked about wanting a home, a place to put down roots after years of constant movement. As the fire burned down to embers and the stars wheeled overhead, they sat close together, Grace leaning against Ethan's shoulder while he wrapped his arm around her. It was comfortable and right in a way that made Ethan wonder how he had ever lived without this feeling. The journey back to Rock Springs took 5 days, moving more slowly because of the weight they carried and the caution required to protect their precious cargo. They encountered no trouble, though they stayed alert for any sign of bandits or anyone else who might be interested in what they carried. When they finally rode back into town, dusty and exhausted but triumphant, Samuel Bradshaw nearly fell over in shock at seeing them return. "I will be damned," the old shopkeeper said, staring at their loaded saddlebags. "You actually found something." "We did," Ethan confirmed with a grin. "And now we need to find an assayer who can process this ore and tell us exactly what we have." Samuel directed them to Martin Fletcher, a former prospector who had settled in Rock Springs and now made his living assaying ore for the mining operations in the area. Martin examined their samples with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every kind of mineral the earth could produce, and his eyes widened as he realized what he was looking at. "This is high-quality ore," he said, weighing a chunk in his hand. "Very high quality." If the rest is like this, you are looking at a significant find. It took Martin 3 days to process all the ore they had brought, separating the gold from the quartz and refining it into pure metal. When he finally presented them with the results, even Ethan was stunned. They had extracted $18,000 worth of gold, far more than his initial estimate. Grace stared at the gleaming bars of precious metal, tears streaming down her face as the reality of what they had accomplished truly sank in. "My family will never have to worry again," she whispered. "They will have everything they need. And you will have what you need too," Ethan said gently, "a future of your own choosing." They arranged for most of the gold to be converted to bank drafts that could be safely sent to St. Louis, keeping enough cash to cover their immediate needs and future plans. Grace wrote a long letter to her mother, explaining everything that had happened and how the money should be distributed among the family members. Ethan could see the weight lifting from her shoulders as she wrote, the burden of responsibility finally being shared. With their business in Rock Springs concluded, they began discussing where they wanted to settle. Ethan had always been drawn to the idea of raising horses, breeding and training quality stock for ranchers and the cavalry. Grace was enthusiastic about the idea, and together they began looking for suitable land. They found it 20 miles outside of Rock Springs, a beautiful valley with good water, rich grass, and enough space to build both a home and the facilities they would need for a horse ranch. The land was owned by a family moving back east, and they were eager to sell to someone who would care for the property. Ethan negotiated a fair price, and they purchased the land with some of the gold they had kept back. Standing on their own property for the first time, looking out over the valley that would be their home, Ethan felt a sense of rightness that he had never experienced before. "This is ours," Grace said, wonder in her voice. "Our land, our future." "Our everything," Ethan agreed, pulling her close. Together, they were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Rock Springs, with Samuel Bradshaw and Martin Fletcher standing as witnesses. Grace wore a new dress she had purchased with her own money, pale blue with white lace, and Ethan thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed Grace with all the love and promise he felt in his heart. Their first year together was hard work but filled with joy. They built a house with their own hands, a sturdy structure of logs and stone that could withstand the harsh Wyoming winters. Ethan designed a barn and corrals for the horses they planned to raise, and Grace created a garden that provided fresh vegetables through the summer and enough preserved food to last the winter. They purchased their first breeding stock carefully, selecting horses with good bloodlines and strong temperaments. Ethan's years of experience with cattle translated well to horses, and he proved to have a natural talent for training. Grace worked alongside him, learning quickly and developing her own skills as a horsewoman. Letters from St. Louis brought news of Grace's family's transformation. Her mother had purchased a small house, and the joy in her words was evident even through the written page. Grace's sister reported that her children were enrolled in a good school, and her brother had been accepted to an engineering program at a university. The gold had changed their lives exactly as Grace had hoped. As their first year on the ranch came to a close, Grace began showing signs of pregnancy. Ethan was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a father, and he watched with protective care as Grace's belly swelled with their child. She remained active and involved in the ranch work, though Ethan insisted she take on lighter duties as her pregnancy progressed. Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1878, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. They named him William Ethan Quinn, honoring both Grace's father and his own legacy. Ethan held his son for the first time with shaking hands, marveling at the tiny, perfect features and the strength in the baby's grip. "He is beautiful," Grace said from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "Just like his father." "He has your determination," Ethan replied, seeing how the baby fought against the blanket wrapped around him. "I can already tell he is going to be a handful." William grew quickly, a healthy and curious child who seemed to have inherited the best qualities of both parents. By the time he was walking, he was following Ethan around the ranch, trying to help with chores and asking endless questions about everything he saw. The horse ranch prospered beyond their initial hopes. Ethan's reputation for breeding and training quality horses spread throughout the territory, and they had more buyers than they could supply. They hired help as needed, employing young men who wanted to learn the trade and were willing to work hard. 3 years after William's birth, Grace delivered a daughter they named Rose Grace Quinn. Rose was a quieter child than her brother, with her mother's green eyes and a thoughtful nature that showed even in infancy. William adored his little sister, and Ethan often found the two of them together, William telling Rose elaborate stories or showing her treasures he had found around the ranch. As the years passed, the Quinn Ranch became one of the most successful horse operations in Wyoming. They built additional barns, expanded their breeding program, and developed a reputation for integrity and quality that made their name known throughout the region. Grace's family visited several times, traveling from St. Louis to see the life their daughter and sister had built. Grace's mother was particularly moved by the ranch, seeing the tangible results of her late husband's dreams and her daughter's courage. She spent hours talking with Ethan, thanking him for being the partner Grace needed and for honoring the map that had started everything. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Grace riding up into the mountains, following the trail they had taken that first time when they were hunting for gold. They rode to the canyon with the twin pillars and made their way to the waterfall where they had found their fortune. The vein of gold was still visible in the rock, though they had taken enough that the exposed portion was now much smaller. They stood together looking at it, remembering the exhaustion and exhilaration of those days. "You ever regret it?" Grace asked, leaning against Ethan as they watched the water cascade down. "Choosing partnership over a share of the gold." "Not for a single moment," Ethan said honestly. "The gold bought security and opportunity, and those are valuable things. But what we built together, our life and our family and our love, that is priceless. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." Grace turned in his arms and kissed him, and it was as full of promise and passion as their first kiss had been years before. "I love you, Ethan Quinn," she said fiercely. "Thank you for being my partner in everything." "Always," Ethan promised. "In everything, always." They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold that reminded Ethan of that first day when he had seen Grace ride into Rock Springs. So much had changed since then, and yet the core of who they were remained the same. Grace was still fierce and determined, still willing to face any challenge that came her way. And he was still the man who had recognized something special in her from the very beginning, who had offered partnership and found love. Their children grew into capable, confident adults who helped run the ranch and eventually brought partners of their own into the family. William married a schoolteacher from Rock Springs, a smart young woman named Sarah who shared his love of horses and the land. They gave Ethan and Grace their first grandchildren, twin boys who were as wild and energetic as their father had been. Rose, true to her thoughtful nature, took her time finding the right partner. When she finally did, It was a veterinarian who had come to the ranch to treat one of their horses. Daniel was patient and kind, with a genuine love for animals that made him a perfect fit for the ranch life. They settled on the property, building a house near Ethan and Grace's, and Rose continued to be actively involved in the horse breeding program. As Ethan grew older, he often found himself reflecting on the path his life had taken. He had started as a drifter, a cowboy with no real direction beyond the next job. Grace had changed everything, giving him not just love but purpose, a reason to build something lasting instead of just passing through. The map that had brought them together hung framed on the wall of their home, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. Visitors would sometimes ask about it, and Ethan would tell the story of how Grace had ridden into Rock Springs with a map to gold she could not reach alone, and how he had offered to be her partner. "Best decision I ever made," he would always conclude, usually with Grace standing beside him, her hand in his. On Ethan's 60th birthday, the family gathered for a celebration at the ranch. All the children and grandchildren were there, along with friends and neighbors who had become part of their extended community over the years. There was food and music and laughter, the kind of gathering that spoke to a life well lived and a family deeply connected. As the evening wound down and the younger grandchildren were carried off to bed, Ethan and Grace sat on the porch of their home, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. They sat in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, as they had sat countless times before. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night we camped together?" Grace asked softly. "About sitting under the stars and thinking about whether you were on the right path." "I remember," Ethan said. "I was searching for something I could not quite name. And did you find it?" Grace asked, though the smile in her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "I found everything," Ethan replied, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "Purpose, home, family, love. I found a life worth living, and I found it with you." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together as the night deepened around them. Two people who had started as strangers brought together by a map, and had built a lifetime of love through partnership, respect, and unwavering commitment to each other. Years continued to pass, bringing the inevitable changes that time always brings. Ethan's joints grew stiffer, and his once dark hair turned silver. Grace's face gained lines that spoke of years of laughter and occasional worry, but her green eyes remained as bright and fierce as they had been the day she rode into Rock Springs. They passed the daily management of the ranch to William and Rose, content to offer advice when asked, but trusting their children to make their own decisions. It was a transition that some parents struggled with, but Ethan and Grace had always believed in preparing their children for independence rather than binding them with control. On a spring morning when Ethan was 68 years old, he woke to find Grace already up, standing at the window of their bedroom and looking out over the ranch. He joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, and together they watched the sun rise over the land they had built their life on. "What are you thinking?" he asked, resting his chin on the top of her head. "I am thinking about how blessed we have been," Grace said softly. "When I rode into Rock Springs that day, I was desperate and afraid, carrying the weight of my family's needs and my father's dying wishes. I never imagined I would find this. A partner who became my love, a ranch that became our legacy, children and grandchildren who carry our values forward. It is so much more than I ever dared to hope for. We built it together," Ethan reminded her. "Every piece of it. That was always the point, not the gold but the partnership." "Keep the gold, I want the partner," Grace quoted, turning in his arms to look up at him. "Those words changed my life." "They changed both our lives," Ethan said, kissing her forehead. And I have never regretted them for a moment. They spent that day as they spent many days now, walking the ranch property together, checking on the horses and visiting with their children and grandchildren. Rose's youngest daughter, a 6-year-old named Grace after her grandmother, insisted on showing them a bird's nest she had found, and Ethan lifted her onto his shoulders so she could see it better. "Great-grandfather, will you tell me the story again?" Little Grace asked as they walked back to the house. "About how you and great-grandmother found the gold." It was a story Ethan had told many times, embellished slightly with each retelling to keep the children engaged, but he never tired of sharing it. It was their origin story, the foundation of everything that came after. "Well," he began, settling the child more comfortably on his shoulders, "it started on a hot August day in 1876, when the most determined woman I had ever seen rode into town with a map and a dream." As he told the story, walking slowly with his great-granddaughter giggling on his shoulders and his wife walking beside him, Ethan felt a profound sense of contentment. This was what the gold had really bought them, not luxury or ease, but the opportunity to build something meaningful. A family, a home, a legacy of hard work and partnership that would continue long after he and Grace were gone. The seasons continued their endless cycle, and the Quinn Ranch adapted and evolved with changing times. New techniques in horse breeding were incorporated. Modern conveniences gradually made their way even to rural Wyoming, and the children and grandchildren brought their own innovations and ideas to the operation. Through it all, Ethan and Grace remained the heart of the family, their love story becoming the stuff of local legend. People in Rock Springs still talked about the woman who came with a map to gold she could not reach, and the cowboy who valued partnership over treasure. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the family organized a massive celebration. Friends and neighbors came from all over the territory to honor the couple who had become pillars of their community. There were speeches and toasts, and Ethan and Grace danced together while everyone watched, moving to the same music that had played at their wedding 5 decades before. 50 years, Grace marveled as they swayed together. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like just yesterday that we were climbing that canyon looking for gold. "Every day with you has been an adventure," Ethan said, and he meant it. Even the quiet days, the ordinary days of just living and working together, those have been precious. Grace's eyes filled with tears, the happy kind that spoke to deep emotion. "I love you, Ethan Quinn, more now than ever if that is possible." "It is possible," Ethan assured her. Love is not a finite thing. It grows and deepens with time, with shared experiences and challenges overcome together. What I feel for you now is so much richer and more complex than what I felt that first day, as strong as that was. They finished their dance to applause from the gathered crowd, and then William stood to give a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that the greatest treasure is not gold or material wealth, but the partnership we build with the people we love. You showed us how to work hard, how to treat others with respect and dignity, and how to face challenges with courage and grace. Everything good in our lives comes from the foundation you built together." The toast was echoed by everyone present, and Ethan saw his legacy reflected in the faces of his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. They were all strong, capable people, grounded in good values and prepared to face whatever challenges life might bring them. That was worth more than any amount of gold. As Ethan entered his 70s, his health began to decline in small but noticeable ways. His hearing was not what it once was, and he tired more easily. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Grace and their family never wavered. Grace, too, showed the effects of age, moving more slowly and occasionally needing to rest in the middle of the day. But she remained involved in the ranch, offering guidance on the breeding program and teaching her grandchildren about the horses she had learned to love. On a cool autumn evening when Ethan was 74, he and Grace sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and a light breeze carried the scent of hay and horses. "I have been thinking about the map," Ethan said suddenly. "Your father's map that brought us together." "What about it?" Grace asked, her hand finding his in the practiced way of people who had been touching each other for decades. "I want to make sure it stays in the family, that our descendants know the story behind it," Ethan said. "Not because of the gold, but because of what it represents. Taking a risk, having courage, choosing partnership. Those are the real treasures we found, and I want to make sure that story continues." "It will," Grace assured him. "We have told it so many times to so many people. It is woven into the fabric of who this family is. Long after we are gone, they will still be telling the story of how great-grandmother Grace came with a map, and how great-grandfather Ethan said to keep the gold because he wanted the partner." Ethan smiled, satisfied with that answer. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun completed its descent, and the stars began to appear, the same stars they had watched together for more than 50 years. The years that followed were gentle ones, filled with family gatherings, quiet days on the ranch, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. Ethan's mobility decreased, but Grace was always there, adapting their routines to accommodate his limitations without ever making him feel diminished. When Ethan was 78, his heart finally began to fail. The doctor from Rock Springs made the journey to the ranch and delivered the news gently. Ethan had months, perhaps a year if he was lucky. Ethan took the news calmly, having lived long enough to make his peace with mortality. "I want to go back one more time," he told Grace that evening. "To the canyon, to where we found the gold. I want to see it again before I die." Grace looked alarmed. "Ethan, the doctor said—" "I know what the doctor said," Ethan interrupted gently, "but this is important to me. We will go slowly, we will be careful, and we will have family with us. But I need to stand in that place one more time with you." Grace understood, as she always had. They made the journey a month later, accompanied by William, Rose, and several of the grandchildren. They traveled slowly, taking frequent breaks, and made the trip in twice the time it had originally taken. When they finally reached the Twin Pillars and entered the canyon, Ethan felt a surge of energy that surprised him. Memories flooded back with vivid clarity. The exhaustion and excitement of that first discovery, the back-breaking work of extraction, and most of all, the moment when he had looked at Grace and realized he loved her. They made their way to the waterfall, the grandchildren helping Ethan over the rougher sections of terrain. The waterfall was unchanged, as eternal and beautiful as it had been 52 years earlier. The vein of gold was still barely visible in the rock, a thin line of precious metal that had transformed their lives. Ethan stood looking at it, Grace's hand in his, and felt a profound sense of completion. They had come full circle, from the desperate beginning to this peaceful ending, and every step of the journey had been worth it. "Thank you," he said softly to Grace, knowing their family could not hear him over the sound of the falling water. "For everything. For your courage, your partnership, your love. You gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined." Grace's face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. "We gave each other that," she said. "Together, we built something beautiful." They stood together in that sacred place, surrounded by family, until Ethan's strength began to flag and they had to begin the journey back. But Ethan felt satisfied, having said his goodbye to the place where everything began. He lived for 6 more months, each day a gift he savored. He spent time with each of his children and grandchildren, sharing memories and offering what wisdom he had accumulated. He sat on the porch with Grace, holding her hand and watching the ranch operate with the efficiency they had built into it. On a warm spring morning, with Grace beside him and sunlight streaming through their bedroom window, Ethan Quinn died peacefully. His last words were to Grace, a whispered, "I love you," that she would carry with her for the rest of her days. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Wyoming, people coming from all over to pay their respects to a man who had lived with integrity and built something lasting. Ethan was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, in a spot he had chosen years before because it offered a view of everything they had created together. Grace lived for 5 more years after Ethan's death, remaining active in the ranch and devoted to her family. She never remarried, telling anyone who suggested it that she had already had the great love of her life and needed no other. She spent her final years writing down the family history, creating a detailed account of their journey from that first meeting in Rock Springs through all the years of building their life together. The story, complete with the original map carefully preserved, became a treasured family heirloom. When Grace died at the age of 83, she was laid to rest beside Ethan on the hill, their graves marked by simple stones that bore their names, dates, and a single inscription: "Partners in everything, always." The Quinn Ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, the values of hard work, integrity, and partnership passing down through the generations. The story of how it all began, with a woman who came with a map to gold she could not reach, and a cowboy who said to keep the gold because he wanted the partner, was told and retold until it became the foundation myth of the family. The original map, carefully preserved and framed, hung in the main house where every generation could see it and remember. Beside it was a photograph of Ethan and Grace taken on their 50th anniversary, the two of them looking at each other with the same love and devotion that had defined their entire relationship. Their great-great-grandchildren would grow up hearing the story, learning the lessons embedded in it about courage, partnership, and the true meaning of treasure. Some of them would make pilgrimages to the canyon with the twin pillars, standing at the waterfall and trying to imagine what it must have been like for their ancestors to discover gold there. But the real gold, they all understood, was not the metal extracted from the mountain. It was the partnership that had formed in pursuit of it, the love that had grown from that partnership, and the family and legacy that had resulted. Those were the true treasures, the ones that lasted beyond any single lifetime. The Quinn Ranch stood as a testament to what two people could build when they chose to face the world together, when they valued partnership over personal gain, when they committed to supporting and loving each other through every challenge and triumph. It was a story of the American West, but more than that, it was a story of the human heart and its capacity for courage, sacrifice, and enduring love. And on quiet evenings, when the Wyoming wind whispered through the valley and the stars shone overhead as they had for countless generations, those who knew the story could almost imagine they saw two figures standing on the porch of the old house, hands intertwined, looking out over the land they had claimed together and the legacy they had built. Grace and Ethan, partners in everything, their love story etched into the very soul of the land they had made their own. The ranch continued its operations into the 20th century and beyond, adapting to changing times but never losing sight of the core values its founders had established. Each generation added their own innovations and faced their own challenges, but they all looked back to Grace and Ethan as the model of how to live with integrity and love. The story was passed down not just within the family, but throughout the region, becoming one of those tales that defined the character of the American West. It was a reminder that the greatest fortunes were not always measured in gold or silver, that sometimes the real treasure was found in the partnerships we formed and the lives we built together. In the end, that was the legacy of Grace Opal and Ethan Quinn, a reminder that when we choose partnership over wealth, love over possession, and commitment over convenience, we build something that lasts far beyond our own lifetimes. Their story, like the land they had claimed and the family they had raised, endured as a testament to the enduring power of love, courage, and the bonds we forge with those who stand beside us through all of life's adventures. The map that had started it all remained in its frame, a piece of paper and ink that had changed the course of multiple lives. But it was no longer just a map to gold in the mountains. It had become a map to something far more valuable. It was a map to partnership, to love, to family, to legacy. It was a reminder that sometimes the journey matters more than the destination, and that the people we choose to travel with are worth more than any treasure we might find. And so the story concluded, as all good stories must, with love triumphant and a family secure in the knowledge of where they came from and the values that defined them. Grace and Ethan's love story became immortal, passed down through the generations as an example of how two people, starting with nothing but courage and a willingness to partner with each other, could build something extraordinary that would endure long after they were gone. Their lives had been full and rich, filled with hard work and great rewards, challenges overcome and joys celebrated. They had loved deeply and completely, had raised strong children, and had built a legacy that honored not just their own memory, but the memory of Grace's father and his long search for something that would give his family a better life. In the end, they had found that better life, not in the gold itself, but in what the search for it had brought them, each other. And that was the greatest treasure of all, the one that made all the hardship worthwhile and all the sacrifices meaningful. Their story was complete, their love eternal, their legacy secure. The cowboy had wanted the partner, and in choosing that partnership, he had gained everything that truly mattered: